Hello and welcome to a short video series on doubting climate change and the role of public relations and media in creating doubt amongst the science behind climate change. My name's Stephen Stuart, I'm a professor at St Paul University, and we're going to be taking a journey over the next several weeks looking at various factors that impact the way that the media report on climate change and the way that people in the population understand the situation based on the media reporting they're getting. So some of the things we're going to be looking at, we're going to look at the role of public relations and media in creating doubt and allowing the creation of doubt around the science that's behind climate change. And there's a lot of solid science behind climate change, but the way it's portrayed in the media and the way that science itself portrays its own findings leaves open the door for people to create doubt around that. So we're going to be looking at that in some depth and the process of public relations as well. We're going to understand how science, by the creation of valid doubt in some cases, but how that is undermining the science, and also how, as I said, the media representation of that doubt is enhancing its capability to undermine the work of the scientists. We're also going to be trying to understand how a coalition of Cold War scientists, so scientists based in the US from the 1950s and 60s through the whole Cold War period in relationships between East and West, acting as advisors to government and also with strong connections to the fossil fuel-based energy industries, have collaborated to undermine public trust in science and to mislead the public based on the political ideology that came out of the Cold War political situation. We're also going to see how scientific debate is presented to the public and how corporations and politicians manipulate scientific narratives with the complicity of traditional media and emergent social media platforms. And over the last 14 or 15 years, in the era of social media and the rise of social media, the popularity of social media and the shift of the power in public discourse from traditional media to social media, the impact that's had on narratives that are created in society. We're also going to be trying to understand the basic, as I mentioned previously, the basic structure of public relations, what it is, how it works, and how mass communication works. We're going to understand that the fossil fuel-based energy industries don't deny the reality of human-induced climate change. What they're trying to do is they're trying to delay policy changes that could arrest climate change to allow them to continue to reap massive profits for shareholders in the short term without really considering long-term consequences of what they're doing. And for sure, the energy companies are complicit in this to a very large degree because they've been aware of the science for over 70 years and they've been actively trying to deny it. So these corporations continue to make vast profits as they continue to extract the minerals from the earth and continue with the despoilation of greenfield sites. And what we're going to see over the course of the next 4 years is with the outcome of the US election, we are going to see drilling in previous national parks in Alaska and other sort of unspoiled places. The administration in the United States is going to allow drilling to happen in these wilderness places that are going to spoil the landscape and pollute and damage the environment considerably more than they've been able to in the past. So we're going to try to understand a little bit how the actions of public relations in lobbying politicians enable this to happen. So we're also going to become critically aware of how large corporations can unequally influence public discourse to benefit their own interests at a cost to human and non-human populations. And I want to be very clear that yes, we're concerned about people, my children, my grandchildren, my family, my friends, my colleagues, we're all concerned about people, but also the actions that we allow to happen have a huge impact on other species. And just the natural environment as a whole. And so I'm trying to take a non-human perspective from this, obviously recognizing that we live in a world that privileges humans over other species primarily. So So now we have a sequence of slides from, or images coming out of Valencia in Spain that are very recent in the last 2 weeks, which was, the city was experienced devastating flooding on a very unprecedented scale. And it's just illustrative, not just of what happened to the citizens of Valencia, but what's increasingly happening to populations around the world. The unprecedented levels of climate, or the impact of climate change, so flooding, droughts, et cetera, all of these consequences, we're seeing them on a much more frequent scale. And the impact on humans and in terms of creating human suffering is really profound. But also in economic terms, it's profound. In a report published last week, calculated that the extreme weather over the last decade, over the last 10 years, has cost over $2 trillion. That's $2,000 billion. It's an extraordinary amount of money in terms of the damage that's done that needs to be repaired in infrastructure and housing and this kind of thing. And that the US is suffered one of the greatest economic losses, followed by China and India. So the countries that are creating the majority of the pollution that's working on changing the climate globally, these three countries, and they're the ones that deny it the most or do the least that they can to embrace policies that would reduce the levels of emissions and maybe allow the planet a little bit of a chance to recover. So in terms of what we're going to look in terms of public relations, we're going to look at the evolution of public relations. So looking at the late 19th century, the early 20th century introduction of public relations as an industry, and understand what they do and how they've developed, what's happened over the last 100 or so years in that industry, and why they occupy such a powerful position in society. So we're also going to be looking at what public relations is, the role of advocacy within the world of public relations, the role of lobbying within the world of public relations, and how these things work, understand how they work with government, how they work in the creation of policy and legislation in our society, and also to understand what their intended purpose is. So looking at the finance, the economic structure, if you will, of that industry to allow to understand who benefits most from the policies that are being enacted, and the lack of legislation reining in the power of these energy companies, etc. So overview of advocacy and lobbying, and recognizing that we live in a democracy. So we can see lobbying and advocacy as part of a democratic process until we understand the amounts of money that are involved from corporations compared to, for example, the amount of money that's being spent by not-for-profit organizations who are trying to engender social change to benefit people, particular parts of the population, but they're fighting in an unequal struggle against large corporations just based on the resources that they have. We're also going to be looking at 2 case studies in the process to understand how things that happened in other industries and other parts of society have influenced very greatly what's happening in climate change and public relations, media around that. So we're going to look at what Big Tobacco did, Big Tobacco being an agglomeration of all of the companies in terms of those who produce and sell tobacco-based products. What did they do that's relevant to this series of this video series, and understand the impact of what's called and what's known as the tobacco playbook, that looks at how the tobacco industry from very early on understood the causal relationship between tobacco smoking and lung cancer and other smoking related diseases, but did everything they could to deny that causality, which enabled them to reap vast profits and make lots of money for their shareholders. And maybe touch on a little bit on the economic aspect of that as well, about why governments don't really clamp down and prohibit antisocial activity like smoking. So in terms of the science regarding anthropogenic climate change, anthropogenic is human-inspired climate change. We're going to be examining a little bit about the environmental movement origins, so looking at awareness around climate change and the impact of humans on climate, understanding when it first became something that was discussed. And I think you'd be surprised that it's over 150 years ago that scientists first noticed the impact of the industrial age on climate. And looking at that and thinking about how the movement has progressed over many years to where we are today. And I use as a backdrop here a photograph by a Canadian photographer, Edward Batinsky. And this is a photograph taken from the Atacama Desert in Chile. And the Atacama Desert is one of the largest untouched human wildernesses. It's supposed to be protected. And unfortunately for the desert, one of the minerals that is sitting underneath the desert is lithium. And as I'm sure you're aware, in our shift from gas-powered cars to electric-powered cars and the need for batteries, the majority of the batteries that we use lithium as their core. And so places like the Atacama Desert is one of the largest resources on the planet of lithium. And so there's a huge level of mining and extraction going on in this previously pristine desert just to satisfy the production of batteries. So when we think of electric cars as saving the planet, what we're not seeing on the other side is the despoilation of the extraction industries that are necessary for us to have electric cars, for example. We think of them as green, we think of them as environmentally friendly, but the reality is they're far from that. And so, again, this is part of the narrative that's being pushed by various industries and it's undermining the science, the hard evidence-based science that's behind understanding climate change and the impacts, the human impacts on the climate. The other case study we're going to look at is vaccines and anti-vaxxers, which is a fairly contentious story, I guess, over the last 2 decades or so. So we're going to have a brief history of vaccines and looking at the impacts of vaccines and how they've benefited society in partially eradicating many, many debilitating diseases around the world. And have a look at the more recent history of anti-vaccine, which came largely out of the actions of one man, Andrew Wakefield, who's a British doctor, and a paper that he published in The Lancet he was trying to establish a causal relationship between the MMR vaccine, measles, mumps and rubella vaccine, and the rise in autism. And it was a completely fabricated paper. It should never have been published in the first place. But Andrew Wakefield is now a discredited doctor who's not allowed to practice, but he makes a very healthy living in the United States by continuing to present his work about the danger and the damage that vaccines are doing in society, which is completely unfounded. There's no evidence to support anything that he's saying. And how that narrative has been picked up by J.F. Kennedy, who's now going to be part of Trump's cabinet, etc. And in a statement last week, just before the election, Kennedy said that he was going to be given free rein to ban vaccines in the US. So it's kind of an interesting case study to look at, because it shows how people can create a narrative that's undermining the science because of the way that it's presented in the media. And it creates doubts in the mind of parents, because obviously parents don't want their children to have terrible diseases, but they also don't want them to have autism. And if they think there's a connection between the vaccine that will prevent them having a disease and autism, then maybe it'll make them think twice about having the vaccine, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a good case study to look at in relation to what we're trying to achieve in this video series. Then we come on to how the debate is represented. So this goes to the heart of the series, if you will. The dialogue and media representation, the 97% versus the 3%. And in the next session that we record, we'll go into that 97% and the 3% a little bit more. But we're going to be looking at what the media does when they're presented with a debate or a dialogue that has those kind of numbers on either side of the narrative. So what tends to happen is traditional media has given equal voice to an equal time to both parties, even though there's a lot of evidence on one side and lack of evidence on the other side. And the notion of trying to present a balanced dialogue, but at the same time, they never considered how the public perceives that. So we'll be looking at that in a little bit more detail. And just in relation to that, the BBC, British Broadcasting Company of the State, sponsored broadcaster in the United Kingdom reviewed or revised their impartiality guidelines in 2020 because of exactly that. And I'll read exactly what it says so it's more clear. So impartiality does not necessarily require the range of perspectives or opinions to be covered in equal proportions, either across our output as a whole or within a single program, web page, or item. Instead, we should seek to achieve due weight. For example, minority views should not necessarily be given similar prominence or weight to those with more support or to the prevailing consensus. So what the BBC has done here is they've recognized that in the past they've been giving undue weight to minority opinions where there's not necessarily any evidence to support them, but the public has perceived them as having equal value. So we'll be looking at that in a little bit more detail. And then come to climate change exactly towards the end of the video series. We'll be looking at climate change and what is the science and how is the science presented. And we're also going to be looking at how the deniers and the skeptics are represented within the media, the traditional media, and also how they use social media and through echo chambers and other sort of modern devices that social media enables to create a completely alternative dialogue, an alternate reality, if you like. And that ties into considering the future when we have Kellyanne Conway in 2015, when she was quizzed. She was President Trump's communications director. When she was quizzed about the size of the crowd at his inauguration in 2016, she stated that there were facts and there were alternative facts. And that notion of alternative facts, by which she meant non-evidence-based facts, in other words, opinion, she enabled people to start having conversations where equal importance was given to opinion and to evidence-based fact, and that's really troubling. So we're going to look a little bit about the future, the rise of fake news, and the unchecked lies that go into our world by our politicians, by our leaders, who are following their own agendas. And in that respect, I should put up here, from a climate change point of view, this is a headline from the Guardian newspaper in the United Kingdom, talking about the impact on climate change and the global situation around climate change in reaction to Donald Trump's re-election in the 2024 United States presidential election. And it starts talking about the danger that the policies that the Republicans are going to be following or the dangers of the impact that's going to have on climate change. I'm not going to be partisan here. I don't want to impact the way anybody thinks about politics, but it's just to look at it from an evidence-based perspective. So with that, hopefully this has inspired you to join us in future sessions, and I look forward to sharing more with you in the coming series and over the coming weeks. Thank you.